bios, we have Murdo Ash, who is originally trained as a family physician and practiced 20 years in community health centers in Massachusetts, California, Colorado, and in 2011 trained as a functional medicine provider. In 2016, she incorporated the reversal or stabilization of patients with cognitive decline, an approach first published by Dr. Dale Bredesen. Her original fascination was as an undergraduate in neurobiology and neuropathology. Her practice is in San Rafael, California. And our next host will be Justin Paglino, our next presenter. MD, PhD. He is a published and award-winning MD and PhD living in Connecticut, who transitioned from science and virology to dedicate more time to political activism. Justin has previously served as secretary of his town's Democratic Town Committee and has led a Democracy for America chapter in New Haven, Connecticut. He is an active member of the Connecticut Green Party, Physicians for National Healthcare Program, Medicare for All Connecticut, and Voter Choice Connecticut. Justin ran on the Green Party line for the congressional seat of District 3 in Connecticut in 2020, and now he's running for the same seat in 2022. So he asks for you to consider following and donating to his campaign, which is in the chat box. Mary Holland is a full-time general counsel for Children's Health Defense and serves as the vice chair of the board of directors. Holland has fought on the vaccine choice and safety movement. She has co-founded two nonprofits, the Elizabeth Burt Center for Autism Law and Advocacy and the Center for Personal Rights. In addition, she has published legal articles on critical dimensions of vaccine law and policy. Herd immunity, liability for injury, and the connection between vaccines and autism. Holland has addressed legislators in many states, including California, on vaccine law and policy. She has held briefings on Capitol Hill and the United Nations. So welcome, everybody.
Hi, this is Justin Richardson, and I just want to break in for a moment to make sure the schedule and kind of the ground rules are clear for everyone. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes in the first round, and then we will have a second round where each speaker in the same order will have 5 minutes each, and that's a chance to kind of respond to anything that they heard from the other speakers. And then after both rounds, 15 minutes each, followed by 5 minutes each, we'll open it up for questions and comments from all of the participants. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the first speaker, Murto.
Yes, hi. So first of all, of course, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I think this was a really interesting to get a chance for me to reflect a little bit on where we are, how we got here and what I'm thinking. And also, I guess I don't want to focus the whole talk on vaccines, but then my part of it sort of look a little bit more generally at the whole situation. And there are basically three general points that I'd like to make. So first of all, my first point is that I think we did it wrong. I think we did the COVID pandemic wrong. I think we should have closed sooner and longer and better and done it the way that the countries that went after zero COVID did it. And you know, one of the things that I did for this talk is to put off actually doing any planning because I thought something new would arise at the last minute. And sure enough, in the last 10 minutes, I see a tweet from Peter Hotez, who is one of the vaccine developers and a very big vaccine proponent, and he's agreeing with Eric Feigelding. I don't know if you guys know these people, but they've been very prominent basically in COVID, and they're agreeing that there's going to be more boosters because of the new variants. That the new variants are in fact probably going to be a problem. So I think that zero COVID really was our best. Our best option, and that we didn't take it. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of how that came about. Second, that I think that we are even now, we're sort of missing the opportunity to come out ahead as a result of the pandemic. I mean, when you have a challenge, one of the things you can do always is to come up with a technique that's, or something to do that is going to be a win-win, that you're going to incorporate this challenge and come out better on the other side of it. And then finally, I think we spend way too much time shaming each other and not enough time putting in societal safeguards that would end up benefiting everyone, both the virtuous, and the undeserving, whatever you want to call the different people on the different sides of the shaming debate. So first of all, just thinking back at January 2020, from early that month, I found that the news out of China were actually really concerning to me. Even though I hadn't been concerned with SARS or MERS or H1N1, I was concerned about this virus. And in looking at our leadership for response, I was really disappointed. I wasn't seeing it. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Messonnier from the CDC, the WHO, our local public health leaders, basically to a person, they all said, for much too long, they know that there was nothing to fear. In retrospect, it's so sad to think about where we were at, almost like we lost our innocence in this thing. They told us we were safe and that we were safe some more, and that we only needed to test people from Wuhan. I mean, I don't know if you guys can even remember back to those days. And in retrospect, we lost a lot of people really who wouldn't have died at an age at which they wouldn't have died, if you look at the statistics. So basically what we did is we sat around waiting for what we learned was exponential spread. And, we learned a lot about exponential function in the last year. We learned we should slow the spread, but it wasn't really made clear that that meant stretching out the pandemic to 10 years, because it would have been really easy. The calculations at the time were that we would have had to stretch the pandemic out to 10 years in order not to exceed hospital capacity. And so in response to that piece of information, other countries like New Zealand decided to close down severely and eliminate the virus. And it wasn't just island countries. There were also many countries that weren't islands that succeeded in this approach. What we did instead is that we rejected the approach. It's called containment. So we rejected it, and instead we chose a strategy called mitigation, and got inspired by one particular article in Medium that was called The Hammer and the Dance. And then you look at this now and you think that was kind of dumb in retrospect. I mean, we really didn't do the hammer very well at all. Many states didn't do it at all, and many places didn't do it for long enough or very well. Few fines in the United States compared to other countries. So basically we didn't really do the hammer, and then because we didn't really do the hammer, it was never really safe enough to open up and really go for it. So personally, I haven't been to a restaurant really since last year. I guess I did. I went to one outside. So as you remember, we've had these endless debates. Where is it okay to go to a restaurant? Is a tent all right? Is this the flu? Is this not the flu? What is the infection mortality rate? These are all terms that no one had even heard, regular population hadn't even heard about until it became important to have an opinion on this. Could we protect the elderly? Could we leave society open? Could the elderly somehow be protected so they wouldn't get coronavirus? Were lockdowns shutting the economy, or was the virus shutting the economy because people are afraid and that's why the economy is shut down? It feels like we debated everything except an option that some countries were adopting and therefore being able to open, which was zero COVID. China, that's kind of what they went after. We criticized them for being, taking liberties away, but then when you lose your life, that's also a way of losing, a lot. So Vietnam and Singapore and Taiwan, and then of course Australia and New Zealand, which are not totalitarian countries. Many island states, tiny island states especially, managed to get to zero COVID. The maritime provinces in Canada have been very successful. And so there's been a lot of success around the world. Hundreds of millions of people are living under zero COVID. So on the other hand, we put all of our resources, really billions of dollars, into therapeutics and vaccines. And so from an integrative medicine perspective, one of the disappointments there is that in my personal and my professional life, every day I see how making improvements to people's bodies, like you can actually improve a person, nutrient levels, food quality, exercise, sleep, the microbiome. And when you do that, you can reverse their health issues and make them go away. And so it seems like we're doing so much money is being put in research. It's just like, it's disconcerting that none of it would be put into, maybe we can learn to make people healthier. And also from a public health perspective, we talk about risk factors being things like diabetes and obesity, cancer, people with organ transplants. And then of course the organ transplants are related to diabetes, hypertension, same thing, right? Cancer is totally related to toxins in the environment. Diabetes, obesity, also related to toxins in the environment. So we're swirling around these public health issues that are actionable and that we already know quite a bit about, and yet billions of research dollars are going into only therapeutics and vaccines. So personally, I because we have not proven that, you know, a good diet and enough supplements is going to save me from a bad coronavirus outcome, I'm very happy to do the vaccine. I don't think it's going to harm me in a significant way. I'm much more concerned about SARS-CoV-2. From a functional medicine point of view, SARS-CoV-2 as a virus is very likely to cause autoimmunity. And so this is what we're seeing in long COVID, and also this is what we're seeing in people who get COVID. Their stream ends up themselves, and it's part of the reason why COVID can be such a severe illness. And also in the long term, it is an unfortunate virus to have had. Viruses often are one of the underlying drivers of autoimmunity. So it's not like you can go ahead and let yourself have this, in my opinion. And on the other hand, especially early on before we had a vaccine, any amount of research into how to make people healthier would have helped us, not only in this particular infection, but also for future pandemics, past viruses, and also, you know, because we have an ongoing problem with obesity, diabetes, cancer, and so on. So it's not an either or. It should have been, should be a both and it was an opportunity and we lost it. And there are more lost opportunities. For me, the other big lost opportunity is schools. So my take on the school debate is that I'm really curious when I read that actually low-income people and people of color and those communities actually are not the ones that are most vocal in wanting to reopen schools. One might think that they would be, but they're not. And so it's making me really curious. And from a public health, like my master's in public health and my, the way that I interpret research when I read it, it's pretty obvious that, to me, that there are problems with the way we've seen this situation. The question of whether kids catch and transmit, there's a problem with how we try to gain an understanding of this. And the other is the problem of how is the virus transmitted, right? We're still fighting over this. At this point, we know it's not surfaces, but there's still a debate around droplets and aerosols. And it looks to me like the independent scientists are saying aerosols, which means that masks and distancing will never be sufficient, but ventilation would be very important. And ventilation would also help children who have allergies and asthma, and it would also help with influenza, because influenza can be a problem for children. And beyond that, actually, you can think better in a well-ventilated room. They've shown that as you increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the air, it's harder to think and harder to focus. And so here was an opportunity to improve air quality in schools, and instead we have these debates that center around other things, like whether teachers are, I don't know, lazy or something like that. So to me, these are lost opportunities, and also they show the way in which we quickly turn to attacking each other, you know, and to shaming each other instead of coming up with solutions that actually, you know, not that we'll ever look back and be happy that we had this pandemic, but it would have been nice to look back and feel a little bit more, you know, a little more like we gained something, like we understood something or gained something or made something better because we had to go through this. I have a couple more minutes, so I wanted to point out a couple of things. One is this idea of sort of personal containment versus mitigation. One of the things that I heard a few times in the pandemic was my public health leader telling me that I should relax because there was space in ICU. And I hope, I don't know, I hope someone tells these people, because I mean, I've tried to email them, but I don't think I get anywhere, that we don't determine our behavior based on whether there's space in ICU. That's not how it works. From their public health point of view, you know, that might be a consideration, but from my point of view, I just want to be safe. My behavior really, I don't pay attention. It's not about whether there's space in ICU. I'm going to try not to end up there. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting to watch is, I guess, you know, people being focused on medicine and testing, uncertainty, and on research, and you know, the sort of the messiness of research. I think that I hope that we learn something from that. And my hope is, in general, you know, that we will learn that humans can be made healthier. You know, that would have been something that not only learned, but I would have loved for us to learn more about how humans can be made healthier. And also I would have liked that schools be made healthier and safer, because we do know how to improve air quality in schools, and it's affordable actually. And then also I hope that people do learn that science is really messy and that's the way it is. And then also, most importantly, that we need honest people in charge, because yeah, we're vulnerable. So basically, that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Myrto. And next, we will turn it over to Justin. Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, am I unmuted? Yeah, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Thank you to the host for having me. Thank you, Dr. Ash. That was interesting. You know, I agree that we did miss an opportunity to really get this pandemic under wraps early on, like we did with, you know, like China did with SARS-1. You know, this is SARS-2. SARS-1 was a very similar virus, and they kept it under control, and it didn't get out of the box, and it was a success story. And you know, and masks are cheap, and social distancing is cheap. I mean, lockdowns are expensive and costly, but I think, you know, with some more leadership, at least on PPE, we could have had a better chance. But we really needed leadership with contact tracing and the like. But here we are. My talk is going to be focusing on vaccines and just trying to share my interpretation of some of the information that's out there on the vaccines. I have an MD and a PhD and a background in virology, but I'm not portraying myself as the be all end all expert or anything of COVID and SARS. But I do have a background that helps me kind of wade through the information with some facility relatively. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions, but any questions I can't answer, please, you know, send them to the host, and I can try and answer them on my own if I can be of help. so this is the coronavirus. You guys are familiar with the spike protein that folks are talking about. We've really been through a horrible year in this country, which is going to be my focus. Many other places, of course. We are now at 29 million cases. That's diagnosed cases. That's about 9% of our population, and 534,000 deaths. That's 1 out of every 616 people in the country that have perished to this virus, which is pretty remarkable. And I always do this whenever I see the numbers in the news. I always do the division. I always divide the deaths by the cases to get a back of the envelope estimate of the case fatality rate. And with these numbers, it's at 1.8% of cases are fatal. But you got to always remember that there's a lot of asymptomatic cases, right? I mean, we're kind of familiar with this phenomenon now, but we don't really know how many more cases there are out there. It's more than 29.5 million. It could be twice that. It could be 3 times that. We really have a hard time really knowing for a variety of reasons. So vaccines that I'm going to talk about take advantage of our immune system. So just a very, immunology, very complicated, but just a basic overview of what happens when you have a cell infected by a virus. There's cells in your tissues called dendritic cells or antigen presenting cells that eat up the dying cells, and they take everything in and phagocytose it, ingest it, break it down into pieces, and then they travel through the lymph nodes. Oh, let me get the pointer. Oh yeah, cool pointer. Can you see the pointer? They travel through the lymph nodes. In the lymph nodes, they're surrounded by immune cells, the B cells and the T cells, and the B cells and T cells are really amazing how they have all these receptors that are randomized, basically. So they're hopefully ready for anything. They don't know what nature's going to throw at them, but they randomize the receptors using genetic tricks and try to be ready to bind anything and they try to do a good job of binding something that is not self. So they're trained in the thymus to recognize what the self looks like, self proteins, and then only attack things that are foreign. So once you've revved up your B cells, they can go out into the tissue, they can go out into the bloodstream and produce antibody. The T cells can go out into the tissue and kill infected cells. It's important to remember that this is the process when you are infected. Even if you've been vaccinated, if you have been vaccinated, basically, or if you have immunity from a vaccine or prior infection, what's going to happen is this process will just happen faster. So you'll still get cells infected if you're exposed to virus, and those will be taken to the lymph nodes, but waiting in the lymph nodes will be B cells and T cells that will be familiar with this. They'll say, oh, I've seen this before, and they'll ramp up really fast and mount an extremely quick, robust response to stop the infection, not keep it from happening, but stop it very, very early. So I mentioned about, well, what if you've had previous COVID? So here's one study from England. They took 12,000 healthcare workers, 11,000 of them, no antibody against coronavirus. About 1,000 of them did have antibody against coronavirus, meaning they had been exposed. And they followed them for 31 weeks to see how many in each group come down with COVID just through day-to-day living, even though they're all trying to be careful, but they would test them regularly by PCR. So they're looking for even asymptomatic cases, anything they can detect by PCR. 200 people in the antibody negative group became positive, but only 2 in the antibody positive group. So if you do the math and divide by the denominators, you get a risk of COVID of about 1 in 10,000 if you were naive, if you'd never been exposed, but only about 0.13 in 10,000 if you started with antibodies. So it wasn't zero risk. Apparently there were a couple people who, despite having already had COVID, were able to become reinfected with it. but the risk of getting it was 10 times lower. So the effort with a vaccine is to try to mimic the immunity you get from natural infection, of course, without all of the associated risks of COVID, including death, but also all the things short of death that you can experience from COVID. And so, I'm just going to review some of the vaccines that we've been able to come up with that have been licensed in the US. So starting with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So this is an mRNA vaccine, which is a novel type of vaccine. mRNA usually created, in the nucleus and goes to the ribosomes and instructs them what proteins to make. In this case, we're bringing in mRNA from the outside in a liposome, just a little ball of fat, a lipid nanoparticle, and it's in a ball of fat so that it can get absorbed into cells in the muscle when it's injected. And once it's in the cells, the RNA can find its way to the ribosomes, which read the message and make protein. And the protein they make is that spike protein that's on the outside of the virus. And they make the entire spike. And as soon as the immune system recognizes that a foreign protein is being made in these cells, it will go through that process of digesting the cells, taking to the lymph nodes, educating T cells and B cells to fight against this protein, the one that they've seen. So this BioNTech trial, 43,000 participants, none are under 16. They've got 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, and the results were. So they didn't look at everyone by PCR. They waited to see if anyone got any symptoms. And so if you had one symptom of COVID and you were PCR positive, you were considered to be a positive case of COVID. And in the placebo group, which was about half of the participants, there were 162 cases. And in the vaccine group, there were 8 cases. And here you kind of see the progress over time, days after dose 1. Here's day 21 when they got their second dose. So between day 0 when they got their first dose and day 21, both groups were kind of contracting COVID at a similar rate, but around 2 weeks after the first dose and continuing on, people who received the vaccine got, became symptomatic of COVID at a much lower rate, whereas people who had just gotten the saline placebo kept acquiring COVID at a pretty steady pace. So you look at this and you say, okay, this is, they calculate this as 95% efficacy. That's just dividing 162 by 70. If you do that, you come out with that's how they calculate the efficacy rate. And in terms of severe COVID with advanced symptoms, they saw 9 cases in the placebo, but 1 in the vaccine group. So there was at least 1 person there in the vaccine group who was not protected from getting severe diseases. So Sarah, hi Sarah. Sarah asked some really good questions about vaccines, vaccine safety, and I don't think I can really answer them all in great detail, but I just wanted to try and address a little bit of them and talk a little bit about how the way I think about these things. So, for example, so Sarah showed me this vaccine from Physicians for Informed Consent. So, this is, like you said, Sarah, what you have to do is you listen to experts, you do your own research, and you make the best decisions you can. And that's all any of us can do, including me, including anybody. So, and you want to, but I advise to seek out a variety of information from a variety of sources, and then just try to make the best decision you can. And it's not easy, especially with these things. There's so much detail. It's really difficult to gauge risk in these situations, but we do the best we can do, right? So for example, this publication, which I gathered was tend to be a little on the skeptical side of the safety of the vaccines, or at the very least is trying to really be transparent and clearly informative of what they see as possibly the risks or what are the unknowns. And I think it's right to say that you can't necessarily trust the people selling the vaccine to give you the full story, right? And that's partly why they have the FDA, of course, but then you have to wonder, well, how much do we trust the FDA? And we could go back and forth on that. I don't have a yes or no answer. I think there's a lot of great people working at the FDA, but you always just have to be careful about everything. But I want to give you my take on this because I think it's kind of informative. So this publication from Physicians for Informed Consent said, okay, in subjects 65 to 74, the vaccine may only be 53% effective. And in subjects 75 years and older, the vaccine may be 0% effective. So when I read that, I was like, whoa, I hadn't heard, that the vaccine was 0% effective. Now, they didn't say it was 0% effective, right? They said it may be 0% effective. And this gets into the nitty gritty of how science is done and how studies are interpreted. So I dug into the paper and here's the data that this is based on. This is from the Pfizer data. And if you look at the vaccine group versus the placebo group, this is overall, they had 8 cases of COVID in the vaccine, 162 in the placebo. And here it is broken down by age. If you look at age, say over 75, there were 0 cases in the vaccine group, 5 cases in the placebo group. Okay, so what does that mean, right? Well, this is how statisticians make their money, by telling you whether this means something or not. And even as a scientist, you have to consult with statisticians. I mean, you can't even, it gets so complicated, it gets crazy. But if you were just looking at this at face value, you might say, hey, no cases in the vaccine group, 5 cases in the placebo group, looks like the vaccine's working well. But with statistics, you got to also say, hey, wait, but that's only 5 people. You don't know if this is such a small sample size, does that really mean that the vaccine is 100% effective, right? It's too small a sample size. So that's the point they're making here, is we don't really know the significance of this. Now in papers, they report this uncertainty using 95% confidence intervals. So for example, here they say, okay, if you look at all the data in the study, they're going to say that it's 95% protective, right? 95%. But is 95% the real number? Well, they say, and this is where it gets, so they say we have 95% certainty. The statisticians say we are 95% certain that the real efficacy, if we were to test everybody, is somewhere between 90 and 98%. Okay, so that's their range. And that's all calculated using their algorithms and whatnot. So when you look at this, 0 to 5, there's a huge range of uncertainty because the number is so small. So the 95% confidence interval, you'd say, oh, it's 100% effective. Nobody got it in the vaccine group, but 5 people got it in placebo. And that's 5 over 5 plus 0 is 100% protection. But, they give you this statistic to show you that they don't really know. And their 95% confidence interval here is -13 to 100. Okay, so you look at that and you say, and that's the statistics telling you that the number here is too small to really make a solid conclusion. And that's what they're pointing out here. Although I do think they pointed out in a way that's it's true. What they're saying is true, but it's not the whole story. And the whole story is kind of, yeah, we don't really know. There's some hint here that the vaccine may be protected, could be protective in this group. It's just a problem with science and needing big numbers to really become confident in your conclusions. And that's just the nature of the beast. How much time do I have left? I didn't really notice when I started.
If you could wrap up in about the next 30 seconds or so, that would be on time.
Okay. So in terms of safety of these vaccines, this publication pointed out that there were 2 times more serious adverse events in the vaccinated group. Okay, adverse events come in mild, moderate, and severe. But then there's another adjective for adverse events, which is serious. A serious adverse event is something that's really kind of, serious, like it's concerning, like it's really going to affect the person's safety and functionality and possibly life. There were 4 cases in the Pfizer trial. There were twice. So they had 0.6% of people had a serious adverse event with the vaccine, and 0.5% of people in placebo. You have to remember that anything that happens bad to a person who's in a trial, they record it. If they're in a traffic accident, if they have a heart attack, anything, it's recorded as an adverse event. But then the question is, okay, do we see more adverse events in the people who got the experimental treatment? And do we think they're related to the experimental treatment? There were these 4 cases where one was a shoulder injury related to vaccine administration. I don't know how that happened. One was right axillary lymphadenopathy. That's swollen lymph node in the shoulder, in the armpit. And that's not totally unexpected. Sudden ventricular arrhythmia, that's very serious. That's a heart arrhythmia that could be lethal. And right leg paresthesia, that's very interesting. So these are rare events, and it's hard to know. They think maybe it could be related to the vaccine, but you need bigger numbers to tell. So since I've kind of run over, I will stop. I just wanted to, I'll go to the last thing I wanted to say is that these variants are of concern. We really, Dr. Ash was mentioning, we're really keeping an eye on these variants. What happened in Manaus, Brazil is very concerning. They had a spike and serology looked like 70% of people had been immune, which we thought would be herd immunity. And then lo and behold, recently now they're having a second spike and they've got this P1 variant. So it's very concerning. Does this mean that the virus has figured out a way around the natural immunity? And it does seem to have at least partly done that. This is one study, but it's just in vitro. They're trying to look at how effective a person's antibodies for who's been vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine are at neutralizing different variants of the virus. And this is the South African variant. That one's quite down low, so that's concerning. So, we're really at an interesting moment here where we're ramping up and getting this vaccine out on everybody. But the question is it really, how much is it gonna help us? I'm still optimistic that because it creates a polyclonal response, and I'm hoping that the vaccines will be effective. And I just want to let everybody know, if you want to look out for where some of the latest information is on harm, like the information that's come out about anaphylaxis, keep your eye on the CDC morbidity and mortality weekly reports page, because they do a really good job keep updating the public with the latest information. Okay, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. And now we will turn it over to Mary Holland with the Children's Health Defense. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you so much. And my thanks as well to the organizers for such a useful event. So I was struck by the questions that were posed to me, which I thought were not typical questions and really good ones. And the questions were, do you think that there's an issue of regulatory capture? What do you think of the way that the mass media is dealing with this? What's not being discussed? And what are other countries doing? So I want to address those 4 points because I think they're important. And then I want to touch on a few of the things that my colleagues have just mentioned. So on the issue of regulatory capture, certainly we at Children's Health Defense think that that's a very serious problem. So at least half of the budget for the Food and Drug Administration, which gives emergency use authorization to products against the pandemic and will license and approve products, they get half of their fees from industry, from the pharmaceutical industry, at least half of their fees. And so they're not always neutral, and certainly some of the committees that have been put together to look at the vaccines in particular had a very strong presence of people from industry. The Centers for Disease Control, which has a committee that recommends vaccines, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, virtually has never seen a vaccine that it didn't like. Literally, it approves and recommends almost every vaccine that comes to it. It's rare, extremely rare for them not to do that. And the National Institutes of Health, which is another critical agency in this sort of configuration, is deeply engaged in the research and development and financing of the therapeutic and the vaccine interventions in this pandemic. So in particular, the National Institutes of Health just got $7 billion in the most recent CARE 1.9 trillion package that came out, and HHS got $50 billion for testing and tracing. So, you know, the pandemic has been good for the public health establishment and for the pharmaceutical industry, and it's been very good to billionaires. It's been very, very good to the Amazons of the world. It has not been so good for the middle class or for working class people, for sure. So I would just sort of note those things about regulatory capture. And maybe in the same vein, I would just say that the pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Moderna is in a joint venture with the National Institutes of Health. They're not known for their good behavior. The major pharmaceutical companies, 4 of them produce almost all of the recommended vaccines, Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi, and Glaxo. They've paid $33 billion in fines for falsifying data, bribing doctors, and lying to the public. And they are the same people that have been putting money into these vaccine companies, CureVac, BioNTech, Translate Bio, Moderna, to develop these new products. These aren't really startups. They're getting financing from big pharma. So that's sort of about the major actors, both in government in the United States and the pharmaceutical industry. The mass media, sad to say, the mass media gets 70% of its finance, its advertising revenues come from the pharmaceutical industry. Since the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, it's been lawful in the United States to engage in direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. We are one of 2 countries in the world that permit that kind of advertising. The only other country is New Zealand, which has a population of 4 million. It is highly unusual around the world to have this kind of direct-to-consumer marketing of pharmaceutical products, including vaccines. And even the American Medical Association came out a few years ago against this kind of direct-to-consumer marketing, because people are really not in the best position to make judgments about prescription medicines. So sadly, from our perspective, the mass media is not covering this story. It's not giving people the information that they need to be able to make well-informed choices. And I think the whole world has embraced the concept of prior, free, and informed consent to all medical interventions. And so obviously information is absolutely essential. And so we felt so hamstrung by the level of exclusion from mainstream media and also from censorship in social media that we have devised our own daily newspaper at Children's Health Defense, which is called The Defender. And it's been coming out every day since late October. And we get millions of readers a month. So it's clear to us that people are hungry for really well-researched, thorough information about not only COVID, but other issues relating to toxic exposures of children in particular, but we've certainly been covering COVID more generally. And when I say other toxic exposures, we write about, toxic chemicals. We write about the oil and gas industry. We write about other kinds of, other types of pollution. So we're very much, on board with a green agenda for protecting children's health. So what's not being discussed was the third topic that was sent to me. So I think in that area, it's really not being discussed what the harms have been from the vaccines. We certainly get inundated with information about the harm of COVID, and absolutely, for sure, it can be a deadly disease. I don't dispute that for a moment. Many, millions of people have been infected, and close to 500,000 people have died in the United States. So it's certainly nothing trivial. Nonetheless, these vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, and now the Johnson & Johnson vaccines that are on the market in the United States, They were only observed in clinical trials for approximately 10 weeks. They have not been approved. They have not been licensed. They have been given emergency use authorization, which means that they may be effective. They have not been proven to the FDA's satisfaction based on these very, very limited clinical trials to be effective. Typically, vaccines take 10 years to go through the process whereby they can be licensed and then approved and then recommended. This was about 10 weeks. So we're seeing these clinical trials actually last until 2022. And in fact, people are being invited to take experimental investigational vaccines. So since the first one, Moderna, came on the market in the United States in the middle of December through March 5th, to the vaccine adverse event reporting system, the only real available reporting system to people, we've seen 1,524 deaths and 39,771 reported injuries. Now, it's what they call a passive reporting system. It is not 100% accurate. It means they have not been fully investigated. That's a separate discussion and a problem in and of itself. But these are rates of injuries and deaths that are frankly unprecedented. 97% of the injuries and deaths that are being reported right now for vaccines are coming from the COVID vaccines. And the descriptions are very consistent with some of the things that one sees from COVID itself. I think it's easy to agree. Okay, so then the last issue is other countries. So I would say that, we don't take a position on the medications or on other countries, but I would point people to sort of another counterexample of Sweden, which did make the choice to have voluntary measures. They did not close down businesses. They did not have closures of schools or of churches or of other houses of worship. They asked that the elderly be protected and that they be isolated in some sense and given supplemental protections. They encouraged people to be careful and to social distance, but they did not impose lockdown measures as happened in the United States in many states and in many counties and regions. And they certainly did have worse outcomes initially. They did have more infection. And as people were trying to figure out what were adequate therapeutics, they did suffer higher rates of injury and death. But over time, they have kind of, sifted out. So it's not entirely clear to me that, longer, harsher lockdowns would have been better. Certainly the collateral effects of lockdowns have been deaths of despair, suicides, people being extraordinarily depressed, people being deprived of regular medical interventions that they need, cancer screenings, other kinds of emergency medical care. The issue has come up about self-care and treatments. Indoor environments was in this in the letter that was sent to me. We've had many publications written about the sort of remarkable effect of vitamin D supplementation. There's very robust science that vitamin D level is associated with both severity and mortality in COVID. So then the issue, I wanted to say a little bit about the clinical trials for Pfizer. So I think it was great to have Justin do a deeper dive on that. From my perspective, a very interesting article that was published in the British Medical Journal, one of the most preeminent medical journals in the United States, or in the world rather, was by an article by Peter Doshi. And Peter is an associate editor of the British Medical Journal. And what he found is that the 95% efficacy for the Pfizer vaccine is based on some of the information, but not 4,000 pages of information that was sent to the FDA and available. And what he found is that, the only thing that was used to determine efficacy was PCR testing, which does not test for infection. They did not do genetic sequencing, a second test to really determine whether people had COVID. And it turned out that there were very large groups of people in the placebo group and in the vaccine group that had what was called suspected COVID. And when you actually counted in the cases of suspected COVID, the efficacy rate went down to as low as 19%. I am not a physician, I'm not a scientist, but this is published in the British Medical Journal. It certainly raises questions about the transparency and accuracy of what the public is being told about these vaccines. So then the last but not least, I too am very concerned about new variants that seem to be circulating and that do pose real risks to the global population. I would urge people to look at something that was just sent to the European Medicines Agency. That's the equivalent of the FDA in Europe. It was written by 12, very prominent scientists, including a scientist named Michael Yeadon, who worked as the head of respiratory science at Pfizer Global R&D for 17 years. And this letter says that if they do not answer 7 questions that these scientists posed about the clinical trials for the Pfizer vaccine, they urge that they withdraw the vaccine from the marketplace, that they just simply have not been properly safety tested to be in prime time. And then just this last week, and I'll conclude with this, a very remarkable letter was published on LinkedIn by a PhD virologist and veterinarian named Geert van den Bosch from Belgium. And his view is that it's absolutely improper to put a vaccine, and I'm sorry, I want to say this gentleman worked for the Gates Foundation, developing vaccines, and he worked for Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, works very closely with the World Health Organization. So this man has impeccable credentials in the vaccine establishment, if you will. And this gentleman is very concerned that it is very problematic to go out with a vaccine in the context of a pandemic. Typically, the way we've been using vaccines in the last 100 years is in a prophylactic sense to prevent illnesses from taking root. But what we're doing now by going out with vaccines that already may be ineffective because of these new variants, we're actually we're putting pressure on the virus, and we are accelerating its mutation. And this gentleman at the end of this open letter, and I urge you, there's a really remarkable interview that he just did with a physician that's available on the internet. He says, no one should be granted a right to implement large-scale pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical immune interventions, especially not during a viral pandemic, and certainly not without an in-depth understanding of the immune pathogenesis of a viral pandemic. When one follows the science and nothing but the science, it becomes extremely difficult to not label ongoing mass vaccination campaigns as a crime, not only to public health, but also to individual health. And it's very strong language. And this is somebody who, develops vaccines for the Gates Foundation, which has really been at the forefront of the vaccine agenda for the last 20 years. So I think there are really important questions. We don't take a position on whether someone should choose to vaccinate or not. It's absolutely, from our perspective, an individual choice that has to be made based on informed consent. But there are certainly very serious questions that people should be asking before they make that really momentous decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So now we're going to go one more round again with the speakers. Call this a speed round. You have up to 5 minutes to add to your previous and or respond to anything else that you've heard today so far. So we will go in the same order, and we'll start with Murto. So I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, sure. So early in the pandemic, I got the sense that I needed to follow this carefully because I would have some of these questions that Mary Holland raises to answer. And there were some, so as you follow the scientists, actually, I didn't really focus on mainstream media. I tried to follow, or on the CDC, I tried to follow some scientists on Twitter specifically and read the articles and use my Master's of Public Health expertise and research design expertise for this. So I know a lot of these situations that that came up, and I have to say I really disagree with Mary. So going from the last to the maybe earlier, Geert van den Bosch was sent to me by a friend And I looked him up, and he promotes natural killer cell vaccines. So he has a conflict of interest. I don't know if this is the reason why he's so forceful, but it's a little bit suspicious to me that he has an actual alternative vaccine to promote. And yes, the point he makes is interesting, and it may be true, but we're also a little bit stuck at the moment. The pandemic is raging, but I just wanted to point out that he's alone arguing what he's arguing. I don't know anything else about him other than that he does develop something that would be a competitor. Peter Doshi, yes, it's true. The Pfizer trial had large numbers of suspected COVID in the vaccine group, but that's because these suspected COVIDs were having side effects from the COVID vaccine, not because they were coming down with COVID. And you can tell because these suspected COVID cases were clustered around the time of the vaccine and dropped off after the couple of weeks of the vaccine. And so that's why you had a whole bunch of suspected COVIDs that turned out negative on PCR, because they weren't infected, they were just getting muscle aches and some fever from the shots themselves. So, you have to read carefully, and you have to have a lot of expertise, because otherwise I think you get, it's basically you're buffeted by all of these arguments from all different sides. Also the suicide argument, let's put that one to rest. Suicides have not increased in the United States during the pandemic. Potentially, yes, addiction, I believe that those numbers may have gone up, but not only suicides are down, but even emergency room presentations for suicides are down in the country. And in New Zealand, they're way down. I don't think that their lockdowns harmed them. From the point of view of do the vaccines work, what I look at is the numbers in Israel. They look nice right now. One of the specialists I follow is a mathematician, and he's been creating a graph of, I guess, the case fatality ratio. And what that tells you is if you capture all the cases and you protect all your elderly, you're going to end up with a very large number, right? Many, many cases, very, very few fatalities. And it was amazing to watch Israel rise in that graph day by day, week by week, as they vaccinated their population. So the vaccine has managed, it looks like the vaccine has managed to decrease deaths enormously, to the point where now they're above the graph. Actually, they're above the scale of the graph. And all the other countries that are barely starting to vaccinate are clustered in the middle. So I am believing in this vaccine to the point that I did recommend it. I have not recommended another vaccine to my mother, who's 89, in 10 years, but I did recommend, and she got her first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. I also wanted to say that from a functional medicine point of view, I really trust a immunologist, Dr. Aristo Vojdani, who gave an interesting talk. His name is spelled Vojdani. You guys can also look him up. And the article he published showed a lot of cross-reactivity between SARS-CoV-2 virus and different tissues in the body. So he has dubbed the virus the queen of autoimmunity. He's really concerned that infection with the virus will eventually lead to autoimmunity. The vaccine, he says, to be honest, we don't know. We will have to see. There are also potentially ways to become to have autoimmune cross-reactivity with the spike protein. And so my group, the Institute for Functional Medicine, has recommended that we be very cautious with patients who have an active autoimmune process going, because you give them the vaccine, they're going to make a spike, and that they're going to make antibodies to that spike. And if they're in the middle of an autoimmune flare, they might, and this is all theoretical because we don't know, we might actually end up attacking ourselves because being in the middle of a flare. And so it is, irritating to me, because I completely agree that the pharmaceutical companies have been crooks, honestly, and we've been at their mercy. And the only way that we ever find out when they do things that are terrible is because of litigation. And in the case of vaccines, there's been very little litigation, some of it because that's the laws that we pass, that we cannot sue pharmaceutical companies for vaccines that are in the Vaccine for Children program. And therefore, we end up being in the dark, really, when it comes to some of these interventions as opposed to pharmaceuticals, where we find out, stories like Vioxx and bunches of different ones. We are in the dark. These are the same people who haven't been really good players in many other ways, and they're getting really a lot of money to do this. And we're also a little bit stuck. You don't want to get COVID. So that's what I have to say about it. Yeah, I think that's most of my notes.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mary. Sorry, Murto. Next, we'll go to Justin. You have 5 minutes. And
So I wanted to point out that, when adverse events are reported in a vaccine trial, they report them for the placebo group and for the intervention group. And they add up to a good number. Anything bad that happens to the patient to the subject will be reported. And like with Moderna, there was only one case of anaphylaxis in the treatment group, one case in the placebo group. And that's just the point is that these are really small numbers, even though they do the studies on 40,000 people, which is a lot. I mean, these studies are a lot of work. But the numbers, these rare events are so hard to measure because they are rare. And so now what happens is you go into the phase of there being the VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. It's important to remember that those adverse events are reported if they happened after the vaccine. It doesn't mean that they happened because of the vaccine. It's post hoc ergo propter hoc after it, therefore because of it, right? You can't assume just because it happened after that it happened because of. But you're getting all these, but it's an important question you'd like to know. But I'm just saying it is hard to know, because how do you prove whether something bad that happened after the vaccine happened because of the vaccine? So when you say, so I think it's a little misleading to say, there have been this many deaths. It's just, you got to be careful with the verbiage. You can't say, well, there's this many deaths reported from the vaccine. They're just deaths that happened after the vaccine, and out of responsibility, they were reported. But the devil's in the details of trying to sort out causality is much harder, especially when you're talking about trying to investigate one person at a time. This is not a trial. This is not a controlled trial. This is just reporting, okay, this person, something bad happened to them. We may never know. It's hard. The only way to really know causality is to have a trial where you have two arms that you compare to each other. And the ones that have been done are on a much smaller scale than the mass vaccination campaign that's happening right now. So just want people to appreciate that it's really is. So, like with now that they've been millions of doses given of Moderna and Pfizer, they have a better idea of the rates of anaphylaxis, which seems to be the most, as far as I can tell, the most serious life-threatening complication that has come up. And it is something like 11 in a million for one, and maybe 5 in a million for the other. So it's not nothing. And the anaphylaxis is most likely related to the vaccine. I don't know how somebody in the placebo group got anaphylaxis unless the placebo contained some kind of liposomal products without the mRNA itself, which a good placebo would, because you want the only difference between the placebo and the treatment to be the treatment effect, the treatment component itself. I come down, I think, these vaccines I believe are the best we can do for now. I think it's everybody's individual decision whether they want to get the vaccine or not. But given the death rate of the infection itself, I think in a sense, since we are stuck, we don't have an ideal solution. But I do advocate for as much transparency as we can possibly get out of um, from the FDA and the medical system, so we can really, so everybody can get a fair chance to really evaluate the safety as best we can. I'm just making the point that sometimes it is hard because we're talking about very rare events, and causality is something that's just very hard to establish medically and scientifically sometimes. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Justin. Next, go to Mary for 5 minutes. Go ahead when you're ready, Mary.
Thank you. So I could respond to what's been said, but I won't. I want to focus on the vaccine. So from the very first day that the pandemic started, the focus was the only solution is the vaccine. The vaccines are the highest margin. That's what makes the most money. And I think from in many different ways, we can see that therapeutics were not prioritized. Medications to deal with COVID were not given fair sort of opportunities for research and for public discourse. And certainly there's a lot of evidence in other countries that hydroxychloroquine was very effective, that ivermectin is effective, that vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc have been effective. In fact, on hydroxychloroquine, there were 2 studies that were retracted from major medical journals because in fact they used falsified data and they found hydroxychloroquine ineffective. That has not been investigated sufficiently. Vaccines are where the money is. Vaccines are also where extraordinary liability protection is. And vaccines are very importantly where mandates are possible. We've never seen medications be mandated. We have a whole infrastructure for mandating vaccines for children. And we have a legal infrastructure in the United States and presumably in other countries where it's conceivable that there will be adult mandates. And certainly we also see around the vaccines this issue of vaccine certificates and biometric identification. And even though President Biden in his address on Thursday didn't talk about mandates, he talked about making a vaccine available for every person in this country, buying more than are necessary for the whole country. Bill Gates, who has been driving behind the vaccine agenda, talks about vaccinating 7 billion people in the world. There are 7.5 billion people on the world, on the planet. So the issue of mandates and what justifies them is a crucial issue that people need to think about. If you believe that the fundamental premise of medical ethics is prior, free, and informed consent, then you can't be on board with mandates because they deprive an individual of choice. And yet really, I think we're not only going to see that come down the pike in an employment context, as is already starting to happen, but we're going to see it very soon in a school context because there have been clinical trials now on younger children for COVID vaccines. And I believe ultimately we may see it in the adult context. And so that's where I would ask people to really think about, you know, what is right. Let me just come back. I have 2 more minutes. The lockdowns have caused tremendous impoverization, poverty for people, right? It's closed down businesses. It's closed down people's education. Remote learning is not the same as in-person learning. And so whether, you know, it depends on the metrics you use, but lockdowns were never contemplated, even by the World Health Organization, until really this happened. They are an absolute last resort, and yet we seem to have used them pervasively, and they have caused remarkable harms, I think, to the social fabric and to people's economic welfare. And certainly we know that disease is correlated with poverty. I'll just say that the idea that Dr. Bosch, I think he discloses in his letter that he develops natural killer cell vaccines. I don't think he's suggesting that that's the solution to the pandemic at this point. And I don't think he's alone. I mentioned the other scientists who've just written an open letter to the European Medicines Agency to retract the approval for the mRNA vaccines. There's also the Great Barrington Declaration by many, many scientists, similarly arguing that the lockdowns have been doing more harm than good. And then finally, just on this issue of anaphylaxis and these mRNA vaccines, they do contain polyethylene glycol. That is the lipid nanoparticle envelope. And 70% of people are known to have anti-PEG antibodies. 9% of people are known to go into anaphylaxis. So we have some mechanisms that we really understand about what's causing harm with the vaccines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And now we're going to open it up for audience questions and comments. Want to remind everyone that this is a safe space we're creating for everyone to have an open discussion. So, make sure your comment does not contain any name calling, abusive language. Keep it civil, keep it on the topics rather than directed, at people, and that will keep it safe. So I'm going to open up the chat, and you may type your question in the chat, or you can use the digital raise hand feature, and I'll keep a stack and then call on people, mostly in the order they come, but here at the Green Party, we do try to balance it for genders. So if there's been a lot of one gender, we will kind of skip the order a little bit and make sure we hear from everyone. So just a moment and I will enable the chat. And I see some hands coming up. Okay, first hand I saw was Alice Green. So I'm gonna unmute you, Alice. Okay, you got it. Go ahead, Alice.
Hi, I'm a nurse. I got the COVID and I have sort of an autoimmune response. I do think that there is like a chronic inflammatory response to COVID that a lot of people are getting. And that, as Myrta and Mary both mentioned, that if you decrease toxins and you decrease things that cause inflammation in your environment, your chance of having those kind of autoimmune inflammatory responses is decreased. But I wanted to ask Justin about monoclonal antibodies and convalescent plasma. You can't monetize that. And I think the amount of money that was spent on all of the research could have been spent to grow those monoclonal antibodies as well. And that would have been as effective, but not as lucrative for our medical system or for profit. And I'm discouraged by Bill Gates buying the Oxford University research and them selling that to AstraZeneca, when I feel like medicine should not be for profit. As we know, we're kind of in this stuck place, as Myrta said. I'm going to get my vaccination tomorrow, even though I have the antibodies now. Justin, can you speak to monoclonal antibodies? Anything about that?
Well, monoclonal antibodies are I think they're a treatment. Of course, they're not going to offer long-term protection like a vaccine does. The half-life of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but of course they'd be used as a therapeutic for someone who became symptomatic. I mean, I'd have to look at it closely. I mean, I'm not sure. If they're cost effective and they're effective and then have a low safety, good safety profile, then yes, they could be widely used. They're also, the problem is kind of on a massive scale. They require, you have to be admitted to the hospital. So, you can't give them to somebody who has, say, a mild case and they're at home. It's harder to administer an IV, which is part of the problem with currently we have no pill form. Remdesivir is IV as well, the therapeutic drug. So there are several oral medications in the works being studied that are people trying to develop that could be used for patients on an outpatient basis, which is just much more practical for something when it's this widespread.
Okay, thanks, Justin. I know that comment was directed to you. Question, but Murto or Mary, I wanted to give you a chance if you had anything on this.
This is Mirto. I guess I would say that I think so. Convalescent plasma, I think, doesn't work. Monoclonal antibodies do seem to work. And yeah, I think the big problem is that people have to be quite ill and be admitted to hospital. And so you'd have to treat everybody who's at risk. And I don't know that we made enough, but yeah, it could. It could be definitely the ones that we already have could be used. I mean, that would be a start. Yeah. So it was something that we could use more of. And yeah, and again, and I guess I'd have to compare the effectiveness. I think I saw something today, maybe decreases admissions, 12-fold, and become a lot. So it could be really helpful. Definitely, hopefully we look more into it, but still pretty high tech though.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read a couple of questions from the chat, and then I'll go back to going to the raised hands. And these are going to be for anyone who's interested in answering. Marion writes, can you speak more about the alternatives to vaccines? I was hoping for more critical opinions regarding the vaccines and mainstream's missing emphasis on alternatives. And another question from Gail Payne. I'm concerned about long-term effects from the vaccine. I understand that these new mRNA vaccines may set us up for a worse result when exposed to a wild type similar virus in the future. And well, let me stop there with those two.
I guess I can say a little bit about alternatives to, to sort of to the therapeutics and vaccines that we're hearing about. The big problem that we have is that we have a lack of research, right? And so we can say that there are theoretical reasons and research-based reasons to believe that the things that you do to maintain your health are also going to protect you in the event that you get COVID. So if you want to try it that way, definitely do that. But we can't promise you, we can't come near to the sort of promise that a 20,000 or 40,000 person research study is going to give you. And so that what I was saying in my presentation was that I wish a little money had been set aside to take a look at that. For example, some of the studies done on vitamin D showed no effect because they used them way too late. Vitamin D needs to be used before you get exposed. From the point of view of the vaccine's long-term effects, I think in terms of the conventional literature, the belief that they have is that the side effects from vaccines tend to be short-term and not long-term. But then it turns out that actually there is a long-term effect of a vaccine, and that's narcolepsy, which is an autoimmune disease as a result of H1N1 vaccine. So it is pretty muddled in that sense. If your choice was to get the vaccine versus nothing, you could make an argument that yes, it's possible that the antibodies to the spike potentially could cross-react with some of your tissue antigens. But actually your alternative is between getting the vaccine and getting COVID, SARS-CoV-2, because of the fact that it's new and that, well, this is going to change over time when we have a lot of people taking the vaccine. So I don't know, you could hold your breath and isolate longer, but getting the infection is going to be worse than getting just the spike, because there are also antibodies to the nucleocapsid of the virus, and those also are cross-reactive with your tissue antigens. And so therefore, we think it's probable that getting the whole virus is worse than getting just the spike. But there you have it. There's no comparison. And so there's no long-term, they haven't, they didn't even look at the immune parameters of the people in the vaccine trials, right? You could have looked at inflammation rates and you know, what kind of antibodies are elicited and whether they are cross-reactive. You could have looked at all those things, but that's not, of course, how they designed the trial.
May I speak to some of this? So it's important for people to understand that at this point in the game, these vaccines are not approved, they're not licensed, they have emergency use authorization. They fall under the 2005 Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, as somebody put in the chat. That means that essentially, if you're injured, if you can't work anymore, if you become a paraplegic, there will be no compensation from the pharmaceutical industry, and there's very unlikely to be any compensation from the government. There's a tribunal that requires very high levels of proof. None of that proof is going to be there at this point of causation because these are such new products. I'd point out that up until now, these weren't really called vaccines. They were called gene therapy. This is a novel technology, the messenger RNA, the so-called their vaccines. These are really gene therapy. They've never been used in a wide population before. They've never been used in a wide human population before. We really don't know what the long-term effects are. Certainly people like this Dr. Bosch and other knowledgeable scientists and physicians, although a minority, are speaking out loudly that they are quite concerned. I would just point out, as a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, Pfizer in its negotiations with Argentina and Brazil about its security, because the government would not indemnify them, Pfizer asked for Argentina and Brazil to put up their military bases and embassies as collateral for any litigation that might induce liability for Pfizer. So that gives you some idea of how concerned Pfizer is about what may be litigation down the line for injuries or deaths from these vaccines.
I don't know. I would just say, you know, everyone's got their own risk, you know, their own gauge of what risk they prefer. You have, you know, everyone's got to make their own decisions about, you know, there's the risk of the virus, and that's very real. And there's no vaccine that is, and vaccines have risk. And we're trying to, and you know, and you have to try and do your best to kind of gauge what is the risk of the vaccine. And a lot of that is unknowable. If you know, what is the risk in 5 years of the vaccine? Of course, we don't know because the vaccine's only been around for a few months. So there's just some questions that are just unanswerable. And I appreciate everyone kind of looking at this from all angles. And I encourage everybody to keep trying to look into whatever information you can find from a variety of sources to try and make the best decision that you feel comfortable with.
Okay, thanks everyone. Next we have, we'll take two questions in a row who have raised their hands. First, Tina, and then we'll ask Zachary to speak, and we'll hear both questions, and then we'll hear from the three panelists. So Tina, I'm asking you to unmute and go ahead.
Okay. Mari has a quick question first.
I'll go first if you don't mind. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mari Dancer, and my question is directed to Mary Holland. Thank you for speaking with us tonight, as well as testifying with us to the state legislature in 2015 against SB 277. I've read your books. I follow your work. I have a question, which I will read. In California, all medical vaccine exemptions must be registered with the California Immunization Registry, or CAIR, which makes VMEs public record for doctors and the public health department, presumably forever. Attorney Greg Glaser referred me to the CARE lock the record option, but this option locks out VMEs to everyone else except doctors and public health, but they are the only ones who want to know. Also, 2 years ago, our twin sons public school district reported our VMEs to the state against our stated wishes. These are violations of privacy under HIPAA and FERPA. My question is, Will there be a lawsuit addressing these violations of privacy regarding vaccine medical exemptions? If so, will or could this make it to the Supreme Court? Thank you very much for meeting with us today.
Thank you.
Sorry, we're going to take one more question from the audience, and then we'll go around and we can hear from as many people as possible. Zachary, are you able to unmute?
Can you put
Okay, now I can. Why don't you answer that question first? My question is not really related to that question, and so it could be a little confusing.
Okay, sounds good. Go ahead, and then we'll come back to you, Zachary.
So answering the question from Mari and Tina, so medical privacy is a big issue. It's an issue now. It's going to be a much bigger issue given the emphasis on testing and tracing of $50 billion going for that to Health and Human Services. Children's Health Defense is involved in several lawsuits related to exemptions, medical exemptions, and religious exemptions. But we don't have any cases at the moment on medical privacy. But I agree with you, it's a very, very real and important concern. I imagine we will be coming involved with that in due course.
Okay, Zachary, over to you.
Hey, this is Zach Martin. I am speaking from Guilford, Connecticut, so Justin's home state. I would like to ask, so obviously the country has mishandled the pandemic horribly, 500,000 people and climbing dead, the economy in shambles from that, the rich getting richer, the rich getting richer. The rich top 1%'s wealth has actually increased because of this pandemic. So I think we can all agree on that. How would the three of you move forward to make sure that if such a pandemic happens again, it is less disastrous for the country as a whole, so that less people die, less people get sick, less people lose their livelihoods, but so forth and so forth.
Well, briefly, we've kind of underinvested in public health in general, and responding to a pandemic like this requires a lot of resources and a plan, and we really didn't have a lot of that in place. Even though we knew this kind of thing would be coming. When I was in college, I was inspired to go into virology because I knew that outbreaks would be coming. There'd be more coming, and I knew it'd be an opportunity to try and do something to address that. I ended up going in a little different direction with my research, but there's money, right? There's investing in public health experts, and there is the states and need funding for their public health efforts. You know, it's really frustrating because I feel in a lot of ways that we failed in this pandemic because of a lack of kind of taking it seriously from the beginning, which I don't know the cure for that. It's just kind of that's more of a social psychology issue. But from the top down, there was kind of a dismissing of the threat, and that's a larger issue that I think is almost even more fundamental. That there's more of a societal ill that we need to figure out how to get our country to be a little more serious and a little more concerned and a little more interested in pulling together for the common good when we're looking down the barrel of a deadly disease together, instead of going at each other's throats and everything we've seen over the last year. So I don't really have an answer to that, but I'll stop there.
Do you want to go, Murto? You're on mute.
Would you go first? I'm still thinking about this. That's such a great question.
Sure. So I would just say, I think we still don't understand enough about the pandemic. We don't understand sort of the origins. We don't understand the nature of the infection adequately. We don't understand sort of what we did right, what we did wrong. So actually our publication, The Defender, is going to have a petition tomorrow to have a congressional commission. And I think that's really fundamental. But I do think there are serious questions about whether this virus did originate in the Wuhan Virology Institute. I think it needs to be looked into. But around the world, we have about 40 very high level BSL-4 labs that are doing what's called gain of function research. That's essentially bioweapons research. And I think there's real questions about whether that's ethical and whether we should have those labs. And I hope that we start to have a conversation about that. Scientists spoke out against it and put a pause on it during the Obama administration, but that research has continued. And there are very serious questions whether US funded bat virology research in China contributed in some way to this outbreak.
Yeah, I agree with that actually. I think that we don't know, and I mean, they're trying to look into this one, but the fact that there's all these other institutes is important. One thing I wanted to say was about this question of having underreacted to the pandemic. It felt like a choice to me. I mean, I guess what it made me wonder about is the idea of disaster capitalism. It made me wonder if there was a reason why someone wanted a disaster here, because it made sense to them. And I think that plenty of people have profited from it. So yeah, I think the Congressional Commission is a good idea. I think the WHO also, it should be done on an international level, because we should compare the countries' reactions. We should compare what happened in Sweden to what happened in New Zealand. We should see what people were saying, who was lying about what to the population, and who had misinterpreted the sign. We should look at all that, and we should see, what were the outcomes in the end? Who lost population, who didn't, and all the countries in the middle that did sort of wishy-washy approaches. Still now, British Columbia is mandating that private schools remove the masks from the children, because I don't know, because in British Columbia somehow humans are made differently than the rest of the world, or because they have it right. I don't know, but I mean, obviously it's going to have to be looked at, and so I agree with that. So yeah, that's a huge question. How do we do it better the next time? And also, as a part of the Congressional Commission, or some part of something, let's have an institute somewhere. Oh, actually, that's kind of what Institute for Functional Medicine does, but let's look at this question of how do we make people healthier. Clearly, when the vitamin D is higher, people are less likely, almost impossible for them to die of COVID. But what makes a vitamin D higher? That's something that we haven't solved in functional medicine. Is it the same as giving people vitamin D and thus making their level higher? That's not necessarily the same thing in medicine, having a high vitamin D level and becoming high because you took a supplement. So there's definitely much to learn, and with an eye to win-win-win scenarios. It's like, if we learn how to make people healthier, that is good not only for the vaccine and for this virus, but it's also good for the people, because diabetes, hypertension, early death, and disability. But unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, someone should look at this, but from the pharmaceutical company viewpoint, sick people are more profitable than healthy people. So who is running this show, and how do we end up being, the way that we are for reasons that are random?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read a few more comments and questions from the chat. Kind of lump these in a couple of categories. I'm going to read 4 comments. From Madeline, if according to Worldometer, all confirmed cases Of all confirmed cases, only 0.4% are serious. How is that a, quote, raging pandemic? And is no one aware of the study revealing that mortality has been inflated by over 1,600%? And Phoebe writes to Mary and Murto, please speak to the fears of long-term effects, specifically regarding the mRNA vaccines, increasing our risk to future variants. And now in kind of another category, it's more about the pharma industry side of things. Ella states, I'm frustrated that insurance and pharma companies are making bank and our public health system is so underfunded. And Lawrence writes, trillions of dollars were at risk by taking this seriously. There was massive incentive to not do what science demanded. Corporate rule propaganda was in high gear to politicize masks and isolation. We need to work harder to pass HJR 48, the We the People Amendment, to end corporate rule. So I know that's a lot there, at least 2 topics in there. We're just about at time though, so this is going to be our last round of questions.
I can briefly answer the question of this antigen-dependent enhancement. I have not seen any reputable virologist or scientist or person like Dr. Feigelding, who tends to be on the alarmist side of things. I have not seen anyone be concerned about that, so I haven't worried about it, and therefore I do recommend the vaccine to my family. There was something else in there. Oh, the inflating mortality. I also haven't seen any. I mean, the entire world would have had to be in cahoots to inflate mortality. It's been pretty similar in a lot of countries, and so again, I don't believe that. Unfortunately, it's been difficult to figure out who has the truth and who's making up stories, and so it's a lot of work to do that. So good luck, but I haven't seen it.
I'll speak to a couple of those things. So on the issue of statistics, I think it is fairly clear. Dr. Birx made it clear early on that people who died with COVID would be counted as a COVID death. So I think there have been some statistical questions that need to be investigated more fully. There has been writing on this, and that's worth looking at. Some physicians and scientists have hypothesized that actually it's not the virus that's causing the sort of internal bleeding events, but it's rather the spike, and that the spike itself and the vaccine may be problematic. And so I think so far we're seeing that some people who are suffering from long-term COVID symptoms and people who are suffering from having symptoms from the vaccine are suffering similar kinds of disorders. And again, it just needs a lot more research. These are very, very novel products. And even COVID is essentially a new disease that needs further study.
Yeah, I'm also skeptical about the idea of death counts being elevated. I mean, there are, there was this thing about only 6% of the death certificates listed COVID as the cause, and but it's when you die of COVID, this is just a paperwork issue. I mean, when you die of COVID, it's going to list maybe pneumonia as the cause of death. That's the clear cause of death. The vaccine, again, I'm not going to say that the vaccine is harmless. The vaccine is a small part of the virus, essentially. It's the mRNA that encodes the spike protein. If you get the virus, you're getting that. You're getting the vaccine plus a lot more, right? You're getting a virus that can replicate and can spread and throughout the body. But these concerns are possible that, if, the spike protein itself could have some harm. I don't know how much spike protein is going to be circulating in the body after a vaccine, but these are legitimate questions. But if you had to choose, between if you had a binary choice between the vaccine and the virus, I think there's no question that the vaccine is safer. But we're not, none of us is really in that position because we're always hoping that we can avoid catching the virus. And that's just that's just that comes down to your risk tolerance. I'll stop there.
Thank you to all our speakers. That brings us to the end of our time. I wanted to give you a chance to do, a final comment or wrap up in 30 seconds, and also to let everyone know how they might contact you if you're willing to give out your contact info or how they might learn more. Go ahead. Let's do Murto, then Justin, then Mary.
You can find me online. You have my name from the chat, and you can find my email from my website. I don't promise that I'll answer, so it depends on how busy I am, so I might not answer. I don't know that I have any more final words to say. The question of information, disinformation, misinformation, and all that, I guess that's the other huge question this year, and there isn't really, we're nowhere closer to a solution, but I guess just to name it and say that lots of rumors flying around, and how do we learn to become really good consumers and to give, it's been interesting because I've raised some of these issues with my kids, and obviously, they're teenagers and young adults, and so it really does sound like they have gotten better training about this in school, and that they are more critical than I am, that I somehow do it the long way, and they have shortcuts and they come to the same conclusion somehow, or, what else did I want to say? There's some really interesting articles about, I don't know, how age impacts how we use the internet. Anyway, I'll let you guys sort of explore and figure these things out, but yeah, so there's a lot of things that we don't know. There's a lot of decisions we have to take for ourselves. And because of that, it's really important for everybody to have some kind of system maybe, or people that they trust and system that they develop to consume information, because a lot of biased things are thrown at us.
Yeah, and that really is difficult. I want to again thank the organizers for creating this opportunity for people to come and hear from folks, and spend some time thinking about this. And it really is difficult. I just want to briefly say, because I saw in the chat someone mentioned PCR, and Mary mentioned it too. In medicine, my background was in lab medicine, which is diagnostic studies. PCR is used for a lot of to diagnose a lot of conditions, and it's true that when you do a PCR and you amplify a piece of DNA of a certain size, and you haven't sequenced it, you can't say with 100% certainty what that piece of DNA is that you've amplified, and you do have to worry about what the the idea of a false positive. But usually that kind of problem is worked out when the test is being developed. I mean, you develop the primers, you test the test before you send the test out to be worked. So I'm generally not worried about that. I think that every test, no test is perfect. Every test has a sensitivity and a specificity. But for the PCR test, my from what I've seen, they've both been pretty high. Nothing's perfect, but pretty darn high. I'll stop there.
Well, I'd also like to thank the organizers. Just quickly on the PCR point, I would point you to a paper on the internet called the Corman-Drosten paper. So the original cycle threshold was set very high by the German scientist who sort of worked with the WHO. So there are real questions about whether the PCR testing has been as good as it might have been. What I would end with is just to say that Children's Health Defense has a publication called The Defender. You can sign up for free. It'll give more information about the kinds of things I've been talking about. And I also want to say that Children's Health Defense has a chapter in California. I think Alex Meyer, the president of that, has been on this thread. You can sign up for that at Children's Health Defense, and they're doing some fantastic work in California. So it was a pleasure. Thank you all. Next time.